There's a dangerous kind of power that comes with a badge. In the wrong hands, it doesn't serve or protect. It humiliates, it oppresses, it destroys lives. Some officers wear that badge with pride, with honor. Others wear it like a crown, believing they can do anything to anyone. But the problem with power is that you never know when you've crossed the wrong person. "Get your hands off me!" The boy screamed, his voice cracking as his cheek stung from the officer's slap. His head jerked to the side, eyes watering from the force of the blow. The officer, a man built like a linebacker, stood over him, breathing heavily. His uniform stretched tight over his broad shoulders, his hands still raised as if daring the boy to say another word. "You people don't know how to follow orders," he sneered. "Maybe this'll teach you some manners." The world seemed to slow as the boy's father stepped forward, his jaw clenched so tightly his molars might have cracked. His hands curled into fists, but he didn't raise them. Not yet. The officer didn't even look at him. He was too focused on the boy, too blinded by his own arrogance to notice the fire burning in the man's eyes. Big mistake. Because that man? He wasn't just any father. He was the chief of police. The silence that followed was suffocating. The other officers who had been standing around, smirking, suddenly looked uneasy. The people on the sidewalk, some with their phones out recording, stopped whispering. The officer who had delivered the slap took a step back, finally noticing something was wrong. Too late. "You just put your hands on my son," the chief said, his voice as calm as it was terrifying. The officer blinked, confusion flashing across his face. "Wait, what?" The chief took another step forward. "And now, I'm going to show you what happens when a dirty cop crosses the wrong man." The officer's face went pale. He finally looked at the father, really looked at him. His breath caught in his throat. That face. That name tag. Oh my God. How did we get here? Let's go back. Roland Sturridge never saw himself as anything more than an ordinary teenager. He was 16, had an obsession with sneakers, and could spend hours arguing about basketball stats with his friends. He was smart, real smart, but school wasn't his favorite thing in the world. He preferred life outside. His father, Charles Sturridge, was a different story. A man who had worked his way up from patrol officer to chief of police, Charles had dedicated his entire career to keeping his city safe. He didn't just enforce the law, he changed it. Fought for real justice. He had taken on corruption in the force, cracked down on racial profiling, and earned a reputation as one of the few good ones. But here's the thing about being a good cop in a dirty system: people don't like when you challenge the status quo. Which is why Charles kept a low profile. He didn't flash his title around. Didn't expect special treatment. Most of the officers on the force didn't even know what his son looked like. And that was about to be a problem. It was supposed to be a simple night. Just a quick stop at a convenience store after Roland's basketball practice. They had done this 100 times: run in, grab a few snacks, head home. But that night Roland walked in alone. And the second he stepped through those doors he felt it. The eyes on him. The silent judgment. A cop stood near the counter, arms crossed, staring at him. The store clerk, a frail man in his late 50s, looked uncomfortable, shifting his gaze between Roland and the officer like he was waiting for something to happen. Roland had been here before. Not this store, not this exact moment, but this feeling. He had felt it when he walked into certain neighborhoods. When he went shopping and a store employee followed him down every aisle. When he saw women clutch their purses a little tighter when he passed them on the street. It was the feeling of being guilty, before doing anything at all. Still he ignored it. Walked to the back, grabbed a bottle of Gatorade, a bag of chips. His dad was waiting outside, parked just a few feet from the entrance. He stepped toward the register. "Hey," the officer said suddenly. Roland turned. The officer, tall and built like a wrestler, narrowed his eyes. "You paying for that?" Roland froze. "What?" The officer took a step forward. "I said, are you paying for that? Or are you planning to walk out of here without a receipt?" Roland's heart pounded. "Two was just about to pay." The officer scoffed. "Sure you were." Roland looked at the store clerk, expecting him to say something to tell the cop he hadn't done anything. But the man just looked away. Roland felt his stomach tighten. He moved toward the counter, placed his items down. His hands shook as he reached for his wallet. Then, the officer grabbed his wrist. "What's in your pocket?" Roland yanked his arm back. "Nothing." "What are you doing?" "Turn around." Roland's pulse raced. "What?" "Because I said so. I didn't steal anything." The officer grabbed him by the back of his hoodie and yanked him around. Roland stumbled. "What the hell, man?" The officer spun him, pushing him against the counter. "I don't like your attitude, boy." Roland struggled. "I didn't do anything." The officer pulled out his radio. Got a possible shoplifter here. That was when Charles walked in. And what he saw made his blood boil. His son being manhandled by an officer. His son shoved against the counter like a criminal. His son humiliated. What the hell is going on? Charles's voice cut through the tension like a blade. The officer didn't even turn around. Sir, I need you to step back. This is police business. Charles stepped forward. That's my son. The officer huffed. Then you should have raised him better. Slap. The sound echoed through the store. Roland's head snapped to the side, his cheek stinging, his breath catching in his throat. The store went dead silent. The officer had just slapped the son of the chief of police. And the look in Charles's eyes? That was the look of a man who was about to end someone's career. What happens next? Does the officer realize his mistake before it's too late? Or is this the moment his career crashes and burns? Hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next in the story. The store was dead silent. Everyone, customers, the cashier, even the other officers standing nearby, stood frozen. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air like a storm about to break. The officer still had his hand raised, his fingers slightly curled from the force of the slap he had just delivered. His face twisted with arrogance, not yet realizing the line he had crossed. Roland's breathing was unsteady. His cheek burned, but it wasn't just from the sting of the officer's palm. It was the humiliation. The way the world seemed to close in on him, making him feel small. And then, he saw his father. Charles wasn't just angry. He wasn't just furious. There was something terrifyingly calm about the way he stood there, his hands clenched at his sides, his shoulders squared, his breathing measured. He locked eyes with his son. Then, without a word, he turned to the officer. Badge number. The officer scoffed. Excuse me? Charles took a step forward, his voice low, steady. Your badge number. No. The arrogance in the officer's face flickered. He had been expecting a different reaction. Maybe shouting. Maybe threats. But this was controlled. Measured. The officer straightened his posture, puffing out his chest. Look, I don't know who you think you are, but you need to step back. Your kid was acting suspicious and I did what I had to do. If you don't like it, you can take it up with my department. Charles didn't blink. That's so? Yeah, the officer snapped. That's so. Charles exhaled slowly. His grip on his control was slipping, but he knew better than to explode here in front of witnesses. He turned to Roland. Are you okay? His voice softened, but Roland could hear the steel beneath it. Roland swallowed hard and nodded. Charles looked at the officer again. Step outside. The officer gave a short, condescending laugh. Yeah, not happening. Charles's patience snapped. I wasn't asking. The officer hesitated. Something about this man, his stance, the way he spoke felt different. But he wasn't about to be ordered around by some random guy in a hoodie and jeans. I don't take orders from civilians, he muttered, brushing past Charles toward the cashier. That was his second mistake. His first was putting his hands on the wrong kid. Charles reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. He flipped it open, revealing his gold shield. Chief of police. The color drained from the officer's face. The entire store went still. Another officer, who had been watching from a distance, coughed and took a slow step back as if suddenly realizing he wanted no part in what was about to happen. The officer who had slapped Roland? He was frozen. Charles tucked the badge back into his pocket. Now step outside. For a long moment the officer didn't move. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. He looked around as if expecting anyone to step in to bail him out. No one did. Even the cashier, who had been avoiding eye contact earlier, was now watching closely, his lips slightly parted in shock. Finally, the officer turned and walked stiffly toward the exit. Roland let out a shaky breath. His father followed. Outside the air was thick, humid. Streetlights cast a dull glow over the parking lot, but everything still felt dark. The officer stood by his patrol car, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Charles walked up to him, stopping just a few feet away. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pull rank. He just looked at him, really looked at him. The officer couldn't meet his eyes. I'm guessing you didn't bother running my son's ID, Charles said. Silence. Charles took a slow breath. So you profiled him. Assumed he was a criminal the second he walked in. And when he didn't act the way you wanted, you escalated. You humiliated him. And then you hit him. Still no response. Charles tilted his head. This is where you speak. The officer cleared his throat. Look, No, Charles cut in. No excuses. No justifications. Say nothing. Because there's nothing you can say that will make this better. He took another step forward. The officer instinctively took a step back. Charles stared him down, his voice dangerously low. You just put your hands on the son of the chief of police. The officer's breathing quickened. You know what that means? Charles continued. The officer's jaw clenched. Look, Chief, that means your career is over. The words hit like a brick to the chest. The officer opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Charles turned away slightly, then paused. You're going to hand over your badge. You're going to step down quietly. And if I find out you so much as looked at another black kid the wrong way after this, I will personally make sure you never wear a uniform again. The officer swallowed. His hands trembled slightly. He wasn't used to feeling powerless. But that's exactly what he was now. Powerless. Just like he had made Roland feel. Charles exhaled sharply, the rage still thick in his blood, but he wasn't done yet. He looked past the officer, toward the police cruiser where the other officers sat watching. He knew what this was. This wasn't just one bad cop. This was a system. And Charles Sturridge wasn't just going to deal with one officer. He was going to take the whole damn system down. The officer's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. His fingers twitched at his sides, his breathing uneven. The weight of the moment settled on him like a boulder pressing down on his chest. He knew his career was over. But worse than that, he knew his power was gone. Charles stood firm, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't just looking at a cop, he was looking at every officer who had ever abused their authority, every man who had ever used a badge to terrorize the very people they were meant to protect. This wasn't just personal. It was systemic. And Charles had had enough. The officer licked his lips, his voice shaky when he finally spoke. Chief, listen. I made a mistake. Charles raised a hand. Enough. There was nothing left to say. A few feet away, Roland stood near their car watching. His heart was still racing, his head spinning from everything that had happened. He had seen his father upset before, had even seen him yell at subordinates when they messed up on the job. But this was different. This was controlled rage. Roland knew his father wasn't done. Not even close. Charles exhaled sharply, his mind already moving 3 steps ahead. He had been fighting against racial profiling his entire career, but tonight? Tonight it had come for his own son. And it was about to cost someone everything. Before Charles could say another word, the radio on the officer's shoulder crackled to life. Unit 47, do you copy? The officer hesitated before responding. Go ahead. We've got a report of an altercation at the Johnson Plaza. Possible fight breaking out. Are you available for dispatch? Silence. The officer didn't dare move. Charles narrowed his eyes. I'd think carefully before answering that. The officer's throat tightened. He knew exactly what Charles meant. If he responded, if he pretended like everything was fine and tried to get out of this moment, he'd be signing his own death warrant in the department. There was no getting out of this. He lifted the radio to his mouth, voice strained. Negative. Not available for dispatch. The radio crackled again. Copy that. Roland saw the way the officer's hands trembled slightly as he put the radio down. The fear was starting to set in. And then, a new voice entered the conversation. What the hell is going on here? Charles turned his head slightly. A second officer, lean and sharp-faced, stepped forward from one of the nearby cruisers. His uniform was crisp, his stance confident. His name tag read Sergeant Bradley. And the moment Charles saw him, he knew exactly what type of man he was dealing with. The type who enabled men like the officer who slapped Roland. The type who never got his hands dirty but always made sure the messes got cleaned up. Bradley's eyes flickered between the officer and Charles, sizing up the situation. Then he smirked. You look like you've seen a ghost, he said to his officer. The officer stayed silent. Bradley turned to Charles. I'm Sergeant Bradley. What seems to be the problem here? Charles didn't move. The problem, he said, his voice sharp, is that your officer just assaulted a minor. My son. Bradley's smirk didn't falter. But Roland saw the way his fingers curled slightly at his sides. Pause. Then Bradley exhaled, shaking his head. Look, Chief. Don't look, Chief, me, Charles interrupted, stepping forward. I know exactly what you're about to say. That it was a misunderstanding. That my son must have done something to provoke him. That maybe, just maybe, if he had just cooperated, none of this would have happened. Bradley tilted his head, unimpressed. I was actually going to say this isn't the place for this discussion. Charles let out a dry, humorless laugh. Oh, now you want to be professional? Bradley sighed. Chief, let's not make a scene. Charles's entire body tensed. A scene. That was what they called it when a black father stood up for his son. That was what they called it when a man refused to back down. Charles turned to Roland, his voice steady. Get in the car. Roland hesitated. That. I said get in the car. The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Roland nodded, walking to the passenger seat. He pulled the door open, pausing for just a second before getting in. Because for the first time that night, he saw fear in his father's face. Not for himself. For him. As Roland closed the door, Charles turned back to Bradley. "You're right," he said, his voice controlled. "This isn't the place for this conversation." Bradley gave him a tight-lipped smile. "I'm glad you agree. But let me be very clear, Sergeant." Charles stepped closer. Bradley didn't flinch, but Roland could see the slight change in his stance. The way his shoulders squared. The way his breath hitched, barely noticeable. Charles leaned in, voice low. "You think this ends here?" Bradley blinked. Charles's lips barely moved. "You think you can protect him?" He nodded toward the officer. "You think you can cover this up? You think I'm just going to let this slide?" Silence. Charles exhaled through his nose, his control razor-thin. "I am the scene, Bradley." And then, the sirens came. 2, not 3 more patrol cars pulled into the parking lot, their lights flashing. Roland's stomach dropped. His father had just declared war. And the department? They were ready to fight back. The red and blue lights sliced through the night, painting streaks of color across the wet pavement. The low hum of approaching sirens grew louder, drowning out the tension in the air. Roland sat stiffly in the passenger seat, gripping his knees, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. This wasn't just an argument anymore. This was something bigger. His father stood firm as the patrol cars skidded to a stop, gravel crunching under their tires. The air felt thick, dangerous. The first door swung open. A burly officer stepped out, his boots heavy against the asphalt. Another followed. Then another. 1, 2. 3 more officers emerged from the squad cars, each one wearing the same hardened expression. And then, a 4th door opened. This time a woman stepped out. Captain Michelle Brooks. A name Roland had heard before. A woman his father had trusted. Or at least used to. Charles turned slightly at the sound of her approaching footsteps. She was shorter than the others, her frame compact, but she carried herself like someone twice her size. Her uniform was crisp, her silver badge gleaming under the streetlights. She wasn't just another cop. She was his second in command. The 2 locked eyes. "Charles," she said, her tone neutral but unreadable. "Michelle." A heavy silence stretched between them, the night air thick with the weight of a conversation left unspoken. Then she glanced at Bradley, the officer standing just behind Charles. She took in the tension, the stillness of the other officers, the way everyone seemed to be waiting for someone to make the next move. Her eyes flicked back to Charles. "What happened?" she asked, her voice calm, professional. Before Charles could speak, Bradley stepped forward. "Routine stop gone sideways," he said smoothly. "Chief's kid got aggressive. My officer had to de-escalate." Roland felt the heat rise to his face. Aggressive? His father didn't even turn to acknowledge Bradley's lie. Instead, he took a single step closer to Michelle. "That's not what happened." Michelle sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Charles." "Michelle," he interrupted. His voice was measured, but there was a storm beneath it. "Look at my son." For the first time, her eyes flickered toward Roland, still seated in the car. His face was partially hidden in the shadows, but the red mark on his cheek was unmistakable. Her jaw tightened. She knew. They all knew. She turned back to Charles, her expression unreadable. "This isn't the time or the place." "There it is," Charles muttered, shaking his head. "The excuse. The company line." Michelle's face hardened. "That's not what I'm doing." "Then what are you doing?" Charles shot back, his voice sharper now. "You came here to shut this down. To make sure this doesn't become a scene, right?" Michelle opened her mouth, then closed it. Because they both knew he was right. Charles exhaled slowly, then turned, locking eyes with the officer who had hit his son. The man flinched. "Good. You have until tomorrow morning to turn in your badge," Charles said, his voice flat, unwavering. "If you don't, I'll make sure Internal Affairs comes knocking." The officer's face drained of color. Bradley stiffened. Charles turned back to Michelle. "And if you don't handle this the way it should be handled, I'll take it straight to the mayor's office." Michelle's jaw clenched. "You're backing me into a corner." "No," Charles corrected. "I'm giving you a chance to prove that you're not like them." Another pause. Another heavy silence. Finally, Michelle sighed. "I'll handle it." Charles studied her face. He had known her for years, had worked alongside her, had trusted her. But tonight? Tonight, trust wasn't enough. "See that you do," he muttered. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward his car. Roland barely had time to process what had happened before his father slid into the driver's seat beside him. The car was silent. the tension outside still thick. Then finally his father exhaled, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "We're not done," he muttered under his breath. Roland glanced at him, confused. His father wasn't just angry. He was calculating. And for the first time, Roland realized this wasn't about one officer. This was about all of them. Charles wasn't just going to fight back. He was about to burn the whole damn system down. The drive home was cloaked in a heavy silence. Roland stared out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks as they sped past. His cheeks still throbbed, a constant reminder of the humiliation he had endured. But more than the physical pain, it was the look in his father's eyes that haunted him, a mix of anger, betrayal, and something else he couldn't quite place. Charles gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. His mind raced, replaying the night's events over and over. He had spent his entire career fighting against the very thing that had now struck his own son. The system he believed he could change from within had shown its true colors, and it was darker than he had ever imagined. As they pulled into the driveway, Roland finally broke the silence. "Dad, what's going to happen now?" Charles killed the engine and sighed, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. "I don't know, son. But I promise you this isn't over." Inside the house, the atmosphere was tense. Roland retreated to his room, seeking solace in the familiar surroundings. Posters of his favorite basketball players adorned the walls, and his sneakers were lined up meticulously by the door. Normally these things brought him comfort, but tonight they felt insignificant. He flopped onto his bed, pulling out his phone. Messages from friends flooded his screen, most of them having seen the viral video of the incident. His fingers hovered over the screen as he read the comments, some supportive, others filled with ignorance and hate. A notification popped up, a direct message from an unknown sender. Curiosity piqued, Roland opened it. "Hey, I saw what happened. I'm really sorry you had to go through that. If you need someone to talk to, I'm here." It was a simple message, but in that moment, it meant the world to him. He replied, grateful for the kindness of a stranger. Meanwhile, Charles sat at the kitchen table, a glass of whiskey in front of him. He took a sip, the liquid burning his throat, but it did little to numb the turmoil inside. His phone buzzed with calls and messages from colleagues, media outlets, and community leaders. Everyone wanted a statement, a reaction. But Charles wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. He glanced at the framed photo on the wall, him in his uniform, beaming with pride, with a younger Roland perched on his shoulders. It was taken the day he was sworn in as chief of police. He had believed he could make a difference, that he could protect his community from the inside out. Now that belief was shattered. The next morning the sun rose, but the darkness from the previous night lingered. Charles knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. He dressed in his uniform, the weight of the badge heavier than ever before. "Roland," he called out, "I'm heading to the station. We'll talk more when I get back." Roland nodded, his eyes hollow. "Be careful, Dad." As Charles drove to the precinct, he noticed the stares from pedestrians, the whispers. The video had spread like wildfire and everyone had an opinion. He parked and took a deep breath before entering the building. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Officers avoided his gaze, conversations hushed as he walked by. He reached his office and closed the door, the silence almost deafening. A knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he said, his voice steady. Captain Michelle Brooks entered, her expression unreadable. "Charles, we need to talk." He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing. "The officer involved has been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation," she began. "That's not enough," Charles interjected, his voice rising. "This isn't just about one officer. This is about a culture, a system that allows this behavior to persist." Michelle sighed, rubbing her temples. "I understand your frustration, but we have to follow protocol." "Protocol?" Charles scoffed. "Protocol is what got us here in the first place." A tense silence settled between them. Finally Michelle spoke, her tone softer. "What do you want to do, Charles?" He leaned back, his eyes piercing. "I want a full review of our department's practices. I want mandatory bias training for every officer. And I want transparency with the community." Michelle nodded slowly. "That's a tall order." "I don't care," Charles replied firmly. "It's time for change." As the day wore on, news outlets camped outside the precinct, eager for a statement. Charles knew he couldn't hide forever. He stepped outside, the flash of cameras blinding. "Chief Sturridge," a reporter shouted, "do you have any comments on the incident involving your son?" Charles took a deep breath, the weight of his position pressing down on him. "Yes," he began, his voice echoing with determination. "What happened to my son is a reflection of a deeper issue within our department and society as a whole. I am committed to addressing these issues head-on, ensuring that justice is served, and implementing changes to prevent such incidents in the future. The crowd buzzed with questions, but Charles raised a hand. No further comments at this time. He turned and re-entered the building, his resolve solidified. This was his chance to make a real difference, to turn his pain into progress. But as the sun set, casting long shadows over the city, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a battle that would test everything he believed in. The precinct buzzed with an uneasy energy. Officers whispered in hushed tones, their glances darting toward Charles's office. The weight of his earlier statement hung heavily in the air, a clear indication that change was imminent. Inside his office, Charles sat at his desk, papers strewn about, his mind racing with strategies to implement the reforms he had promised. The task ahead was daunting, but the image of Roland's bruised face fueled his determination. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, looking up to see Captain Michelle Brooks entering, her expression a mix of concern and resolve. "Charles," she began, closing the door behind her, "I've been thinking about what you said. About the systemic issues we're facing." He nodded, gesturing for her to sit. She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his. "I want to help. We need to start by reviewing our training programs, implementing community outreach initiatives, and establishing a transparent disciplinary process." Charles felt a glimmer of hope. "That's exactly what I had in mind. But it's going to ruffle some feathers." Michelle smirked slightly. "Let them be ruffled. It's time." As they delved into the details, laying out plans and assigning tasks, a sense of purpose filled the room. For the first time in a long while, Charles felt that real change was within reach. However, not everyone shared their vision. In the dimly lit back room of a local bar, Sergeant Bradley sat with a group of disgruntled officers. The atmosphere was thick with resentment. "He's throwing us under the bus," one officer spat, slamming his fist on the table. Bradley nodded, his jaw clenched. "He's pandering to the public, making us look like the enemy." Another officer leaned in, his voice low. "What are we going to do about it?" Bradley took a sip of his drink, his eyes narrowing. "We need to remind him where the real power lies. If he wants a war, we'll give him one." Back at the precinct, as the evening wore on, Charles and Michelle finalized their immediate action plan. "We'll present this to the mayor tomorrow," Charles said, stacking the papers neatly. Michelle nodded. "I'll rally the support of officers. We need all the backing we can get." As she left, Charles leaned back in his chair, exhaustion washing over him. He knew the path ahead was fraught with challenges, but for Roland, for the community, he was ready to face them head-on. Unbeknownst to him, shadows lurked, plotting to undermine every step he took toward justice. The precinct's corridors buzzed with a tense energy. Charles could feel the weight of every gaze as he made his way to the conference room. Inside, a group of officers awaited, their faces a mix of anticipation and skepticism. Captain Michelle Brooks stood at the front, a projector casting the department's emblem onto the wall behind her. She offered Charles a brief nod as he entered. "Thank you all for coming," Charles began, his voice steady. "We're here to discuss the implementation of new protocols aimed at addressing the systemic issues that have plagued our department." Murmurs rippled through the room. "These changes are not optional," Michelle added, her tone firm. "They are necessary steps toward rebuilding trust with the community we serve." As the meeting progressed, Charles outlined the proposed reforms: mandatory bias training, a transparent disciplinary process, and community engagement initiatives. While some officers nodded in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sergeant Bradley, seated at the back, leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Chief, while I understand the intent, don't you think these measures might undermine our authority? Paint us as the villains?" Charles met his gaze. "Our authority comes from the trust and respect of the community. Without that, we have nothing." Bradley leaned back, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Understood." After the meeting, as officers filed out, Michelle approached Charles. "Some are resistant, but I believe we have enough support to move forward." Charles nodded. "It's a start." Later that evening, Charles returned home, exhaustion settling into his bones. Roland was at the kitchen table, textbooks spread out before him. "Hey Dad, how was work?" "Progress was made," Charles replied, offering a tired smile. Roland hesitated, then spoke. "Some kids at school were talking about what happened. A few of them, their parents are officers. They said you're trying to change things." Charles sat down across from his son. "Change isn't easy, Roland. But it's necessary." As the night deepened, a sense of cautious optimism filled the house. But in the shadows, Plans were being set into motion that would test Charles's resolve and the very fabric of the department he sought to reform. The morning sun cast long shadows across the city as Charles stood before the podium, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The press conference was set to begin, and the room buzzed with anticipation. Reporters shuffled their notes, cameras adjusted their lenses, and the air was thick with expectation. Charles adjusted his tie, his fingers brushing the cool fabric. He had prepared for this moment, rehearsed his words, but now, standing in front of the flashing cameras and expectant faces, he felt the enormity of the task ahead. This wasn't just about addressing the public, it was about confronting the very institution he had dedicated his life to. As he stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but carrying the weight of his resolve. "Good morning," he began, his gaze sweeping over the room. "I stand before you today not just as the chief of police, but as a father, a member of this community, and a man who believes in justice." He paused, allowing his words to settle. "Recent events have exposed deep-seated issues within our department, issues that have caused harm to individuals and eroded the trust between law enforcement and the community we are sworn to protect." A murmur rippled through the room. "I acknowledge the pain and frustration that many of you feel," Charles continued, "and I am committed to implementing comprehensive reforms to address these issues head-on." He outlined the steps they would take: independent oversight, enhanced training programs, and a renewed commitment to transparency and accountability. He emphasized that these measures were not just policies but a pledge to rebuild trust and ensure justice for all. As he concluded, Charles felt a sense of purpose. This was just the beginning, but it was a necessary step toward healing and change. The reporters began to shout questions, but Charles held up a hand, signaling for silence. "Thank you," he said firmly. "I will not entertain questions at this time. The work begins now." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving the room in stunned silence. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, unaware of the storm that had just begun to stir within its heart.